guide me along the way. That's one of those songs that you hear in the traditional church that translates into our church. There's some things that can move across boundaries, and there's some power in that. I want to explore today what that means. What does it mean to let God guide us? How does that change things? We've just had an election. And as a result of this national election, the Democrats have taken over the House of Representatives, and the Republicans continue to reign over the Senate. There were some important things to notice in this election. The youngest woman ever, 29 years old, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, from the Bronx, in the Congress. That's a beautiful thing. Someone who's willing to stand up and deviate from the norm, from the two-party norm. First two Muslim women, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. The first two indigenous women, Sharice Davids, Deb Haaland, Veronica Escobar and Sylvia Garcia, the first Latinas to represent the state of Texas. And we could go on. Ayanna Pressley, the first black woman elected from Massachusetts. Johanna Hayes, the first black woman elected from Connecticut. I mean, in a way, it's shocking to think in 2018 that this is the first. Of all the years this country has been stealing the land of Native Americans, the first time that two Native American women have been in the body that makes the laws. And you know, you're thinking there was a heck of a lot of fraud that went on in this election too. There could have been a whole lot more than that. You know, North Dakota passed a law specifically targeting Native American reservations. Passed a law that said you couldn't just use a P.O. box, had to use a street address, and a lot of reservations don't use street addresses. Obviously, the incredible fraud that's going on in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams has locked it up, totally overwhelmed that Republican, who is presiding over the election. In what world is democracy mean that one of the candidates in the election is also presiding over the election? And there are, you know, they've discovered 700 voting machines locked up in a warehouse somewhere where a lot of particularly black precincts had too few voting machines, maybe had one or two people lined up around the block, didn't get a chance to vote. There's no question but that she won that election in a big way, and she's still fighting for it. She's still hanging in there fighting for it. So these are some powerful moves that we want to acknowledge, and we want to lift up people who are taking on this idea of democracy and trying to bring some reality to the term so that it's not just a myth. Now, we want to look at some underlying issues, and Samuel, way back thousands of years ago, begins to point to the underlying issues that make democracy so elusive. And that is 1 Samuel laid out for us the dangers of concentrated power. And I find it so fascinating that Samuel makes it right clear from the beginning, you want a king? This is an affront to God. You know, we talked last week about God's economy and the way the divine economy has provided abundance for everyone and provided clarity about the particular ways we are to share that abundance, that abundance is never to be concentrated in the hands of a few people, that in Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee, every 50 years, all land goes back to the original owner so that land can never be accumulated through the generations. And here, Samuel is raising a very similar kind of concern around power. That you don't ever locate incredible, overwhelming power in the hands of a few individuals. That is not only going to bring incredible calamity to human community. It's an affront to God. It's an affront to creation. And yet that's what the people wanted to do. Samuel laid it out for them, told them exactly what was going to happen. You want to have a king? Prepared to have your sons taken and put in the military and have them prepared to prepare weapons for war. Your daughter's going to be brought in and to do, I don't even know what that means, to be a perfumer, but, they're going to do it. And, stealing your land and doing all this kind of stuff. It's just treachery. Now, when I first thought about a title for this sermon, I was thinking, I don't know if the treachery of rulers is a very marketable topic. How many people are going to want to come out and hear about treachery? A lot of us do want to hear about treachery. Let's name it. Call it out. So Samuel lays out this fundamental issue that we need to look at. It's not, I think it's so easy to get into this rosy sense that if only we can get the Democrats back, somehow all will be well. How quickly we forget. There's underlying issues. It's not just what's happening on the surface. There's an article in The Guardian which looks at the practices of the 100 richest people in the United States. And these billionaire donors give, unsurprisingly, millions and millions of dollars to impact elections, to impact who gets elected, to impact legislation that suppresses votes, and to impact legislation itself. So what do these billionaire donors want? According to this survey in The Guardian, primarily they want taxes cut, particularly taxes for the rich. They want especially the estate tax cut. They oppose government regulations on banks and the environment. They oppose government programs for health and jobs, and they want the privatization of Social Security. So this is kind of a trend across those who are exercising way more influence. Now, the other thing that happens in our society, in addition to the way laws are skewed and the way property is turned toward the hands of a few, is that this method of government also impacts all the institutions of our society. All of our institutions have a way of kind of taking on this style of governance, this kind of concentrated authoritarian power structure. Even our nonprofit organizations, even our churches, who have been explicit. I mean, the scriptures are pretty clear about what government looks like and what it doesn't look like. Jesus confronted in no uncertain terms the way of government in his day. But, I've been watching this, the United Methodist Church, for example, which I'm most familiar with, we oppose the immigration policies of this government and have been pretty outspoken and to keep people in sanctuary and do things like that. And at the same time, the United Methodist Church has moved mightily to protect the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who is a United Methodist. I was one of hundreds of United Methodist pastors that tried to bring him up on charges. I mean, we have that provision, and it's usually used for the worst purposes. It's usually targeting folks that in the most improper ways. Well, we thought we'd try to use it for a proper means, and to bring him up on charges for child abuse, for separating children from their parents. How in any way does this reflect the teachings of the church? So brought him up on charges, and they found all kinds of ways to skirt around it, nonsense ways, saying that he's a government official and he can't be brought up on charges. There's nothing in our discipline that speaks about that. So most of us kind of rolled our eyes and, turned away. But my mentor, I was so proud of this guy. He's 86 years old. He was my mentor back in seminary, and I've kept in touch with him. He brought the bishop up on charges. And I love that. He brought the bishop up on charges for dismissing the charges against Sessions. And he's 86, he writes letters to the bishop, and he goes, I don't want to do this. I'm an old man. My wife is dying of cancer. The last thing I want to do is a battle, but this is so outrageous. And he just keeps going in on him, and they're trying to deflect him, and he is not having it. He was a district superintendent. He knows the discipline inside and out, and he is not having it. So there's a few of us that are kind of working with him on a team to see what might happen. But, to see the church trying to defend the empire. And we mimic the empire. It's not just the tyrants, but it's our giving over our power to them. So what does lead me, guide me mean? What does it mean to ask God to guide us and then to turn around and let tyrants guide us? What does it mean to call out upon God to be our ruler? What then does that mean in the ways that we lead? Because there is leadership. Leadership is something that's important. How do we lead? What are the ways that we're called to lead that are the opposite of the imperial model? Well, leadership is complex. There's nothing simple about leadership. We need leadership. The opposite of leadership is chaos. And, I think sometimes there are a lot of justifiable arguments about what really is the best way to lead. When we first started this church, I tended to lead in a rather authoritarian manner. And I think in some sense that was justified because there was no ownership yet. We were starting something new, there was no ownership. But then the question begins to become, when does one begin to step back from that kind of hand? Well, I began to step back from a more authoritarian style when people began to challenge me on it. People began to step up and they begin to say, how did that decision get made? And so there's a time when you begin to say, all right, we need to look at, as people are beginning to step up and own this, how do we spread leadership out? How do more of us begin to take leadership? So I want to look at a few models, and then we're going to have some conversation about this. And I want to run through this a little bit quickly because Michael's going to actually come up later as our connecting council chairperson and run us through some actual ways that we are going to try to move our leadership into a more democratic fashion. So I want to leave some time for that. But I want to just mention a few scriptural models, gospel models that might impact our leadership, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. What's important for you about leadership? What do you want to see? What are the qualities you want to see in leadership? So I'm going to mention a few, and they're in the bulletin there. Collaborative, communal, respectful, and gracious. There probably could have been a lot of others. But collaborative leadership is looking for your replacement. Leadership is about looking around and seeing who is it that's called to take my place. Not so that you can squash them and prevent them from threatening your power, but so that you can encourage them and inspire them and mentor them. Because there's no more powerful leadership that is replicating leadership, that is inviting other people into leadership. Leaders are not those who do everything. Leaders are those who invite others to do and to work with them in that way. I look at our growth groups as a good example of collaborative leadership. We've got 3 growth groups going on right now, and I was able to attend all 3 growth groups this week. And there's some powerful stuff happening. The Wednesday group, where Lisa and Chris are leading us in some discussion of the mysteries of the Christian faith and how they connect with the mission of our church. And so this past week, we looked at sin and grace and redemption. And it was so powerful for me to look at, it was really kind of hopeful to me to look at how sin is not a dead end, fall off the cliff, clash and crash. It is a leading up to grace and redemption, that there's great power, that God is constantly renewing us. And so it's an opportunity for us to have some real conversation. And then on Thursday, I attended the retirement group. Now, this has been advertised as something for people of a certain age. And I know some people are like putting this up around retirement. Don't even say that word in my presence. I don't want to even hear about retirement, let alone think about it. But for those of us who are at a certain age, it's a very helpful conversation. And I would say it was a very powerful conversation that we had, really beginning to think about what does it look like to rethink our lives. Because it's not just a matter of not going to work anymore. It's a matter of rethinking, who am I in this new stage of life? So it's very powerful conversation. And then yesterday I went to the group, the Forks Over Knives group, really thinking about what it looks like to begin to engage in a plant-based diet. Why that's a good thing. And boy, I'm going to go back to that growth group because it starts with lunch. And it was good. It was delicious. It was a fantastic, lunch, a movie, conversation. So there's a lot going on. And all of these growth groups are open to anybody who wants to participate. So just step in. Pick one of them Wednesday night, Thursday afternoon, Saturday afternoon, and go. But collaborative leadership is powerful leadership because one person can't bring all of that. It's when we spread leadership out that we begin to experience the richness of what's there in community. And then communal leadership. That leadership is not just about personal interests. Sometimes our leaders have a hard time separating out their own personal interest from their calling. Leadership is a call to serve the public good. It's not a call to serve your own personal good. I always found it interesting that Mike Bloomberg went into being mayor of New York in 2001. He had $5 billion. He made a big deal of telling everybody he wasn't taking a salary as mayor. He only got a $1 a year salary as mayor. He went in 2011 with $5 billion. He came out in 2013 with $25 billion. Now, how do you serve the public good and not take a salary, and your income goes up by 5 times? Was he, anyway, just imagine what's happening. A lot of these folks see being a politician as a cash cow. Their wealth goes up exponentially as they're supposedly serving the public interest. So leadership is always communal. Jesus was very clear about this. Jesus' basically ministry was about 3 years. Jesus did not come here to rule over us for a long period of time. Jesus came in to give a model of leadership and then to move out of the picture and to empower that leadership to step up. And from the very beginning, Jesus was with them for a few weeks and sending them out to do it and kept saying things like, you are going to do the same things that I do. And that's a risk to take. As we were looking in the Gospel of Mary, I have a strong sense that Jesus may have selected Mary to be the first leader. And then there was some kind of power struggle after that. So leadership is always a risk. When you open that up, you don't know exactly, there's no way to fully control it. Leadership is also respectful. We really want to have a boundary between the public and the private. When I first became a pastor in Baltimore, it was the first time I had been the full-time pastor of a church, I followed a woman who had been the pastor there for 8 years, and she was very much beloved by that congregation. And I had a conversation early on with a young fellow named Ethan, who was 7 years old at that time. And he said, Pastor Doug, I didn't know a man could be a minister. He had never had that experience. For the entire 7 years of his life, he had only known a woman as a minister. And he was shocked that a man could also be a minister. Well, a couple of months later, Ethan's father died tragically, 41 years old, of a heart attack. And Judy, his wife, was just absolutely overwhelmed by this. And she called Vivian, the former pastor, to care for her. That makes all the sense in the world. She had known Vivian for 8 years. It was under Vivian's leadership that she had really come fully into her role as a Christian and had taken leadership and was the treasurer in the church. And they had a close bond. And Vivian listened to her and prayed for her and cared for her. And Judy asked her to come out and do the funeral. And Vivian said, well, you have a new pastor now. Pastor Doug is your pastor, and it'd be better if he did the funeral. Now, that's somebody who understands the difference between private and the public. And it was so critical, and it was even hard for me to understand at that time. But that was the day I became the pastor of that church. As long as she continues to serve in that role, and of course she would, because that's where the relationship was. But when does the relationship begin to shift? And her understanding of respecting the leadership was so powerful and really transformed my ministry. And now I'm very close to Judy also. We're not called, it's not a personal thing, it's a role that we play. And finally, I just want to mention that leadership is God-centered. That's clearly what Samuel is saying here. As soon as you concentrate too much power in the hands of a few folks and they begin to think it's them-centered, that they're the one that's bringing everything, they're the wisdom, they're the guidance that's needed. I was meeting with Teresa and Teresa this week, the two leaders of our pastoral search team. And that pastoral search work is overwhelming. You know, it really is. I had no idea what all we were going to be into doing this, but I mean, they're trying to do individual meetings with folks in the congregation, and that's just overwhelming just to do that. And if you want to have an individual meeting with one of the pastoral search team folks, I'd really encourage you to reach out to them, because it's more than they can reasonably do. And they're trying to assemble information, and they've put in our theology together. It's become so much. And we talked, and it's also been very enriching. And there's a powerful team that's coming together to do this work. And they're not going to be able to do everything. What they're doing is opening up a space for God to move, to discern the Spirit of God among us. And I believe that that work is going to be done powerfully. But it's not something that we can kind of control and dot all the T's. We're doing the best we can with it. Sometimes you just got to get in there and do what you can. And you can't control every piece of it. You just got to offer yourself and do what you can and open yourself to the power of God. God has created us. God has called us to do great things. And God will lead us in doing that work. There are human leaders. There is a role for people to be leaders, but it's not to substitute for God. It's not to take on that kind of mantle that somehow you are something more. Jesus was very clear that to be a leader, to be the first of all, is to make yourself last of all and servant of all. That leadership always has to be a servant role. It can never be an arrogant and a holding on to power role. So as we open ourselves to God, as we open ourselves to what leadership looks like in this faith community and what model of leadership we're bringing to the world, let us open ourselves to God's Spirit. Holy God, we thank you for your grace. We thank you for creating us with gifts. We thank you, God, that there is so much leadership potential right here in this room, that so many of us have so many gifts and are exercising powerful leadership in so many spheres of our lives. We open ourselves, God, to who you are calling us to be and how you are calling us to be that. We give you thanks for the privilege and the grace. Amen.
Bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Welcome to the table of Holy Communion. This is the time in our service where we are invited to enter into the gospel story at a moment of choice. This table was set for a community in crisis. God had called them together with a vision, and it seemed like the mission had failed. Relationships were strained and broken. Jesus himself had been betrayed, and the police were on their way. The next day, he would be arrested and crucified. It was in this state that he invited the community together for a meal and invited them to make a choice. Where is your allegiance? What side are you on? We are all invited to this table today. This is our celebration of Holy Communion, and there is a seat and a place set for each and every one of us. Welcome.
As they gathered around the table, as they were aware of the tension and anxiety, Jesus took a piece of bread as they sat and ate and lifted it up before them and said to them, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Take and eat, and do this in remembrance of me." And he blessed the bread, and he gave it to them. And then he took a cup and lifted it up before them and said, "This is my blood, which is poured out for you and for many." He blessed it, and he gave it to them and said, "Take and drink in remembrance of me." Holy Spirit, as we now gather around this same table, as we come forward to receive these gifts, this bread, this dip it in this cup, as we take this mystery into our bodies, as we open our hearts to your movement, God, to your healing, to your transforming touch. Holy Spirit, we submit ourselves to your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.
All are invited to share in this sacred meal. Whether it is your first time here today or you've been here many times before, you are welcome. Come forward, take a piece of bread, dip it in the cup, and receive. Welcome to our celebration of Holy Communion.
Eres mi respirar, eres mi respirar, Dios, tu presencia vive en mí. Eres mi paz, Señor. Eres mi paz, Señor. Dios, tu